In the First World War, Britain and her Royal Navy depended not only on reeking tube and iron shard, Rudyard Kipling's image of the gun and the shell, but also on the ships of the merchant navy at sea on every ocean. It was a power never seen before and never to be seen again.
In 1914, the British Mercantile Marine was the largest in the world and consisted of a vast array of vessels, from large passenger liners, fast cargo liners, steam tramp ships, still some sailing ships, early oil tankers, an enormous coasting trade. It was the world's universal carrier. One chief engineer called it the universal bucket chain. British ships weren't just serving the United Kingdom, they served other economies as well. And they were on station working well away from the UK, on the Indian coast, in the Indian Ocean, on the China coast, on the Japanese coast, in the Pacific, all over the world.
This truly was a world war, the first global conflict. As well as on the Western Front in France, the classic image of the Great War, Britain and her dominions were fighting across the world, with the Mesopotamian campaign in modern-day Iraq, fierce struggles in colonies in Africa and across the Pacific, and in the desperate battles of Gallipoli against the Turks, closely followed by the Salonika campaign in Macedonia, northern Greece.
Amid all this, the demand for troop ships and hospital ships, along with munition ships, was enormous, and the Mercantile Marine was very, very stretched to be able to provide this kind of service. It co-opted every manner of vessel into supporting this particular aspect of the war.
And what ships the troop ships were. Giants, many of them, with names echoing down from the great days of luxury travel by liner. But though these great ships were designed for travel in comfort, once on a war footing, it was a different story. Peacetime luxury was very much a thing of the past.
Our transport was the Olympic, a Leviathan, 46,000 tons, but the men were abominably crowded. They were in the first-class dining saloon, which had its decorations boarded up. All of the porthole glass had been painted black as a precaution against the submarines. Our men's hammocks were so close they were almost touching each other. They were crowded by the hundreds in the most evil-smelling atmosphere. There wasn't nearly enough food for the soldiers. And the man who was in charge of looking after our condenser, he deserted before we left Liverpool. So there wasn't enough fresh water either.
It wasn't only soldiers who were carried by ships to play their part in the Great War. It was essential to free fighting men from the hundreds of tasks needed to support a huge standing army in the field whenever possible. Labour battalions were formed from countries across the British Empire. So began a great movement of peoples, perhaps the largest the world had ever seen. They came from all points of the compass, from Africa, from India, from the West Indies, and even from the newly captured German colonies in China.
You British, you wouldn't have won the war without us. Those trenches you see in all the pictures, we dug them. We mended your roads and your railways at the front, and we carried your shells for you. And we buried your poor boys who were killed. There were thousands and thousands of us, and no one even remembers we were there.
There was another key mission for British merchant ships taken up from trade, a mission of mercy. Here once stood the giant Netley Military Hospital on the banks of the Solent in Southampton, a vital port in the war effort, given over entirely to military shipping. And here, where only the chapel now remains, hospital ships came throughout the Great War, carrying thousands upon thousands of wounded soldiers.
To get an idea of the scale of the operation, it should remember that in 1914 there were only 7,000 military hospital beds available in the UK. By 1916, due to the demand, the number had risen to 200,000 hospital beds, and by the time of the armistice there were 364,000 beds in the UK alone treating wounded and ill servicemen. The majority of these servicemen were brought back to the UK by hospital ships.
Like the troop ships, hospital ships were often converted liners, but repainted in white, with red crosses showing their role as saviours of the wounded from all sides in the conflict. They carried teams of doctors, nurses and orderlies. Sometimes hundreds of medical staff were on board, ready to treat patients. The conditions could be very hard indeed.
We took 700 men on board, and when you think they all had to be fed, 400 cot cases to be washed, fractures to set, dressings to be done, and serious cases to be operated on, you'll realise a little what our work was like.
Once they could get them to the likes of Southampton, they could then be dispersed throughout the country to thousands of Red Cross hospitals that were established across the nation. And this was the whole aim of it. They would be moved by hospital trains. These would be developed as the war went on. And it was highly important because the men could also see that they were being cared for. They were valued. Amputations were rife at the time because of the restrictions in the medical profession, but they struggled on.
18 men dead and 2 officers. That's the rate of at least 10 men a day. At first, many suffer from the shock of their wounds, and it's impossible to save them. Poor boys, we don't even have the time to stay with them until the last.
So these men were coming in with very severe wounds, bleeding, shocked. Again, the nurses knew nothing about them. They didn't know at that point what their injuries were, and they could be overwhelmed not only by the wounds, by the severity of the wounds, but also by sheer numbers and not knowing what was going to come to face them the next minute. But they had such inner strength, such discipline, and discipline within nursing was how they'd grown up, almost military discipline even in civilian life. So they just had to extend themselves to push those skills onto what they were faced with on the ships.
I had to plug a bullet wound in a soldier's back with my finger until the doctor could come. But all the doctors were busy with operations one after the other. But to my relief, this soldier lived.
Troop ships and hospital ships played essential roles in the First World War. Roles too easily overlooked, though little remains of those ships, save some rare treasures, like this beautiful staircase aboard HQS Wellington, first made for the troop ship Viper. But without such ships, the victory could not have been won, and many of the wounded would have died without the care of their angels, the nurses in the hospital ships, and the doctors and orderlies on board. What those ships achieved must never be forgotten, how they played a vital part in the conflict the world hoped would be the war to end all wars.